With the third type of research, the focus moved from the very local to the national and European level. At the same time, the research methods moved on from exploratory and collaborative ethnographic fieldwork to the desk work of reading and analyzing policy reports, scientific publications, and media reports. What researchers were looking for were the more general ideas and policies regarding migration, diversity, and integration that somehow affected the very local arrival situation under scrutiny. It is, of course, crucial to understand how these arrival situations are the product of longer-term policies, laws, and regulations, as well as political ideas dealing with newcomers and migration phenomena more broadly. Overall, this research adds an important national and international layer to the local ethnographic research presented so far. The starting point is that the local dynamics in which newcomers live and work cannot be properly understood without taking into account the broader and ever-changing policy environment. These policies are part of often longer-term discourses concerning migration or mobility and how they drive the ongoing diversification of European societies under conditions of globalization. In Reroute, this package of policies and discourses is labeled Regimes of Mobility and Diversity. Regime was chosen as a central notion because it is strategically vague. On the one hand, regime can be taken as referring to a set of laws and regulations concerning asylum and migration, but also practices constitute regimes. It matters how these laws are implemented through administrative services and institutions, such as reception or detention centers, job or health services, etc. Later on, into the migration trajectory, the regime of migration and diversity regulates what kind of social infrastructures newcomers are able to access and on what conditions. Finally, it is important to keep in mind that regimes are composite, covering a large set of diverse actors, individuals, NGOs, and grassroots organizations, bureaucracies, and authorities, who indeed may not fully agree with one another. Hence, regimes are conflictual fields of interest, contested in many ways, for instance by migrants and those who defend their interests, but also by different authorities, for instance at the local urban level and at the national level. This can be clearly illustrated by an example from Brussels. Within an overall context of shaping a more hostile environment for asylum seekers coming to Belgium, the Secretary of State for Asylum and Migration at some point in 2023 announced that she would no longer provide shelter for single male asylum applicants. Because this goes against the legislation, the Labour court in Brussels convicted the federal government for not complying with the reception obligations. In spite of this, the Belgian state refused to change its policy, which implied that it was up to the Brussels regional authority as well as the different communal authorities to somehow oversee the growing number of drifting asylum applicants, adding to the already large group of homeless people in the city. This quick example gives an idea of two key characteristics of the regimes we are trying to unpack. A, its composite character, including actors defending different interests. B, the entanglement of mobility and diversity. To start with the latter, the Brussels example from the 2022 to 24 period shows how the differentiation of single men from the general category of asylum applicants has a direct effect on their mobility, not only on their physical mobility in having to roam the streets of Brussels in search for often short-term shelter, but also their social mobility with their ability to build more stable social networks or find temporary employment being thwarted. In order to give you a more in-depth idea of what the regime desk research entailed, let us have a look at how Reroute researcher Connie Tippel from the ILS Research Center in Dortmund presents the work of her research team.
There has been a shift in German migration policies, and there's an acknowledgement of Germany as a country of immigration, and diversity is seen as a result of migration, and at the same time this diversity puts cohesion at risks, and cohesion now needs to be actively produced and maintained. So we can often find documents, programs, and strategies that are dealing with this pair of words, diversity and cohesion. And they often focus on growing together and shaping a diverse society. They are also focusing on managing diversity in rival neighborhoods, where also cohesion is especially seen as challenged. And what has to be noted as well is that the discourse has been constantly in flux and it is influenced by certain events. This also reflects sedentarist thinking and a nation-building thinking, according to Mavromatis and Favell. And we can see this in the notion that integration policies should focus on newcomers who are in Germany permanently and legally and who have high prospects to stay. And what is also important is that there's often a notion of participating instead of integration. So when we now look at the local level, at Dortmund and at the neighborhood of Nordstadt, Nordstadt is a classical rival neighborhood, and experts have been saying to us is that Nordstadt and the rival processes there that need to be highly governed, and that they are highly governed. This narrative of a rival neighborhood is very dominant, and there's an understanding that rival processes need to be governed early after the arrival of newcomers. And an important justification for that is that they need to be prevented from exploitative help and support structures. When we now look at the Dortmund path of arrival policies, we can identify an important turning or starting point for this path, and that was the acknowledgement that Romanian newcomers would stay and are not only in Dortmund temporarily. After this acknowledgement, a so-called overall newcomer strategy has been developed in 2013, and it is a comprehensive strategy for managing arrival from different backgrounds, especially refugee migration and from the EU2 countries. And it is based on a close cooperation between the city council and local actors. It focuses on different themes and concrete measures. Now, 10 years later, in 2023, the overall newcomer strategy has been revised, and it has been opened to newcomers from different backgrounds, and now it is based on concrete measures that are tailored to different target groups of newcomers, and that shows a central principle of Dortmund's arrival policies, focusing on the needs of people. When we now look into how these strategies and policies are translated by street-level bureaucrats into practices on the ground, so what newcomers experience every day, we can see an overwhelmed arrival infrastructure in Nordstadt. For example, schools cannot provide enough school places for all newcomer children. And it also sometimes means that street-level bureaucrats go way beyond their ascribed tasks and sometimes even beyond their capacities. And to keep their workload somehow manageable, it leads to a differentiation and categorization between different groups of newcomers, and also to a cooperation with clearly exploitative structures. But on the positive side, we can see that high-level bureaucrats who know the situation in the neighborhood very well influence the citywide dialogue. They report about the situation and the needs of newcomer groups or maybe new demands, and they identify gaps in regular structures. To conclude, first can acknowledge that the Dortmund path of arrival policies is kind of progressive in the German context, and that is because it's a needs-based approach that is open to be adapted to different target groups of newcomers, and also the cooperation between city council and professionals on the ground to adapt to recent developments is kind of decisive in this. On the flip side, it cannot prevent that the infrastructure is overwhelmed and that also professionals on the ground are overwhelmed, and higher policy levels need to acknowledge and equip local efforts, city councils, more adequately to the needs.
Let us conclude this module by highlighting two important takeaways of the site-oriented regime research. First, it is crucial to organize this desk research from the bottom up, to take the site as an entry point. Starting from this local setting, the researcher explores the broader policy and discursive context surrounding the site. This allows the researcher to make precise choices, to focus on these aspects of the regime of diversity and mobility that are relevant for understanding the local dynamics at the level of the site. Second, desk researchers must pay sufficient attention to the composite character of the regimes, the variety of actors and stakeholders, and the way in which they strengthen and reproduce or otherwise destabilize and resist the regime. For example, in the case of the arrival neighborhood of Nordstadt in Dortmund that we just heard about, the fieldwork included local street bureaucrats such as social workers. The findings from this field show that street-level bureaucrats play a role in circumventing the arrival regimes. Street-level and high-level bureaucrats refer to national, federal, and municipal policy documents, and their practices are either in line with or circumvent these policy documents. Furthermore, if policies are regarded as inappropriate by street-level bureaucrats, high-level bureaucrats who are coordinators of local initiatives and projects try to find gaps in the regulations for individual cases. High-level bureaucrats often aim to influence the local discourses and thereby change policies and regulations.